This is Dr. Bev Knox, and you are listening to my Psychology Tutorials. Learn psychology while you sleep. In this lesson, we will review the basic learning concepts, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. By learning, we humans adapt to our environments. We learn to expect and prepare for significant events such as food or pain. That is classical conditioning. We learn to repeat acts that bring rewards and avoid acts that brings unwanted results. That is operant conditioning. We learn new behaviors by observing events and people, and through language, we learn things we have either experienced nor observed. That is cognitive learning or learning via observation. Learning is the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. Associated learning is learning that certain events occur together. The events may be two stimuli, as in classical conditioning, or a response and its consequence, as in operant conditioning. When we speak of a stimulus, it is any event or situation that invokes a response. How do we learn to form associations between stimuli and responses? One major form of learning is classical conditioning, which occurs when a neutral stimulus, one that normally brings about no relevant response, is repeatedly paired with a stimulus called an unconditioned stimulus that brings about a natural, untrained response. Conditioning occurs when the neutral stimulus is repeatedly presented just before the unconditioned stimulus. After repeated pairing, the neutral stimulus elicits the same response that the unconditioned stimulus brings about. When this occurs, the natural stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus, and the response a conditioned response. Learning is not always permanent. Extinction occurs when a previously learned response decreases in frequency and eventually disappears. Stimulus generalization is the tendency for a conditioned response to follow a stimulus that is similar to but not the same as the original conditioned stimulus. The converse phenomena, stimulus discrimination, occurs when an organism learns to distinguish between stimuli. For many people, the name Ivan Pavlov rings a bell. His early 20th century experiments, now psychology's most famous research, are classics. So in Pavlov's famous dog experiment, a dog does not learn to salivate in response to food in its mouth. Rather, food in the mouth automatically, unconditionally triggers a dog's salivation. Thus, Pavlov called this drooling an unconditioned response, and he called the food an unconditioned stimulus. Salivation in response to a tone, however, is learned. It is conditioned upon the dogs associating the tone with the food. Thus, we call the response the conditioned response. The stimulus that used to be neutral, in this case a previously meaningless tone, that now triggers salivation, is the conditioned stimulus. Distinguishing these two kinds of stimuli and responses is easy. Conditioned equals learned, unconditioned equals unlearned. So, what is the role of reward and punishment in learning? Operant conditioning is a form of learning in which a voluntary behavior is strengthened or weakened. According to B.F. Skinner, the underlying learning is reinforcement, the process by which stimulus increases the probability that a preceding behavior will be repeated. Primary reinforcers are rewards that are naturally effective without previous experience because they satisfy a biological need. Secondary reinforcers begin to act as if they were primary reinforcers through association with a primary reinforcer. Positive reinforcers are stimuli that are added to the environment and can lead to an increase in a preceding response. But negative reinforcers are stimuli that remove something unpleasant from the environment, also leading to an increase in the preceding response. Punishment decreases the probability that a prior behavior will occur. Positive punishment weakens a response through the application of an unpleasant stimulus, whereas negative punishment weakens a response by the removal of something positive. In contrast to reinforcement, in which the goal is to increase the evidence of behavior, punishment is meant to decrease or suppress behavior. Schedules and patterns of reinforcement affect the strength and duration of learning. Partial reinforcement schedules, in which reinforcers are not delivered on every trial, produce stronger and longer lasting learning than do continuous reinforcement schedules. Stimulus control training, which is similar to stimulus discrimination in classical conditioning, is reinforcement of a behavior in the presence of a specific stimulus, but not its absence. In stimulus generalization, an organism learns a response to one stimulus and then exhibits the same response to slightly different stimuli. Shaping is a process for teaching complex behaviors by rewarding closer and closer approximations of the desired final behavior. There are biological constraints or built-in limitations on the ability of an organism to learn. Certain behaviors will be relatively easy for individuals or a species to learn, whereas other behaviors will either be difficult or impossible for them to learn. What are some practical methods for bringing about behavior change both in ourselves and in others? Well, behavior modification is a method for formally using the principle of learning theory to promote the frequency of desired behaviors and to decrease or eliminate unwanted behaviors. So, what is the role of cognition and thought in learning? Cognitive approaches to learning consider learning in terms of thought processes or cognition. Phenomena such as latent learning, in which a new behavior is learned but not performed until some incentive is provided for its performance, and the apparent development of cognitive maps support cognitive approaches. Learning also occurs from observing the behavior of others. The major factor that determines whether an observed behavior will actually be performed is the nature of the reinforcement or punishment a model receives. Observation of violence is linked to a greater likelihood of subsequently acting aggressively. Learning styles are characteristic ways of approaching learning based on a person's cultural background and unique pattern of abilities. Whether an individual has an analytical or a rational style of learning, for example, may reflect family background or culture.